I'm glad you've got copies of my lecture. In Sunday school language, it's always easier to learn via eye gate as well as ear gate. And it makes life easier if you can see what I'm saying as well as hear what I'm saying. First of all, I need to explain the topic I have chosen to tackle for these lectures. I was asked to choose an area I'd been studying recently, and this is it. On Tuesday next, I will be flying to Japan to deliver a keynote address at an annual conference connected with the terrible earthquake Eastern Japan suffered in March 2011. It was the worst earthquake ever recorded in Japanese history. It caused a huge tsunami, and that in turn caused the disastrous meltdown of nuclear reactors in the area. All that in addition to the loss of life and property. Every year since, the churches of Eastern Japan have met for a conference devoted to the subject of mission in a context of disaster. Over the years, Fuller Seminary has been asked to provide a keynote speaker. And this year, the committee in Tokyo asked for me to go to provide an Old Testament flavor. While I am there, I've been invited to give a guest lecture to PhD students at Tokyo Union Theological Seminary, and I decided to expand the concluding part of my conference speech on the book of Job into a full lecture. When I received the kind invitation to give 4 lectures here at Gateway Seminary, I decided to make the last of the 4 a sort of rehearsal for the Tokyo Seminary presentation. How about the other 3? Well, I thought I could expand the 3 earlier parts of my conference address. So now you know why you're listening to me on this general topic and why I'm beginning with the book of Psalms to set the scene for the 3 lectures to follow. We need to appreciate that the Psalms summarize a good deal of the Old Testament. When many years ago I became a volunteer hospital chaplain, I remember how frustrated I felt that when patients asked for a Bible, all I had to offer them was a copy of the New Testament and Psalms, which the hospital gets free from a Christian charity. I was reassured when I realized the way the Psalms summarize much of the Old Testament. If the patients got a good dose of Psalms, they would imbibe much of the rest of the Old Testament as well. One truth that both Psalms and the rest of the Old Testament teach is that life confronts us with a variety of situations. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 sums up a number of opposite situations in terms of the different kinds of response we need to deal with them properly, such as there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. The Old Testament contains such a variety of life situations in its pages. The great value of the book of Psalms is that it reflects them in context of praise, prayer, and meditation. In the study of the Psalms, our understanding of them took a giant step forward when it was realized that the Psalms presuppose 3 different situations in the natural and spiritual lives of believers. I'm referring to the work of Walter Brueggemann. In some Psalms, life is pretty good and flows smoothly along. This is the season of orientation, when we are in sync with our circumstances. Then there is the season of disorientation, when trouble comes crashing in and we cannot cope. We're back. Hopefully, after prayer, things improve. And now we're in a season of reorientation. We're back where we were before. But we've learned from our time of crisis and got a new gratitude to God and a new appreciation of life. The first time that Brueggemann brought these three seasons of life to our notice was in 1980 in a journal article entitled Psalms and the Life of Faith, a Suggested Typology of Function. It was reprinted in 1995 as the first of a collection of essays on the Psalms entitled The Psalms and the Life of Faith. In between, my Fuller colleague, John Godingay, wrote a review article on Brueggemann's insight in the same journal, JSOT, in 1981, called The Dynamic Cycle of Praise and Prayer in the Psalms. That word cycle in his title was important, whereas Brueggemann thought in terms of a linear development from orientation to disorientation and then to reorientation. Godingay argued for a cyclical development, but not one that just went round and round repeatedly. No, one that led believers forward in their life of faith in the form of a spiral. So reorientation marks a return to orientation at a higher level, rather than a third entity in any radical sense. The spiral is moving on. I'm convinced that Godingay's assessment of the Psalms needs to be taken seriously. We must beware of Brueggemann's inclination, on the one hand, to regard some orientation Psalms as by nature immature, and on the other, to reclassify those orientation Psalms he likes as reorientation Psalms. In fact, in 1984, he published a commentary on just over a third of the Psalms entitled The Message of the Psalms, a Theological Commentary. In the commentary, he went further and changed the term reorientation to new orientation. Moving away from a cyclical model, he contrasted the old orientation that needed to be unlearned to the new and necessary orientation to God and to life as it should be lived. So can we still think in terms of three seasons? Yes, if we're careful. Reorientation represents the beginning of a return to orientation. It is like the excitement of a marriage and honeymoon after a long period of engagement and before marriage is going to settle into a steady and still satisfying rhythm. Reorientation, represented by the songs of thanksgiving in the Psalms, is emotionally high and excited. The Thanksgiving song captures the magic moment of transition in the cycle of seasons. In the book of Psalms, the brief passion of these Thanksgiving songs is matched by the real but quite different passion of the prayers of lament, while outside both stand the calm and settled world of orientation. A rhetorical marker of this season of orientation is the expression shall or will never be moved or shaken. To be moved or shaken is to undergo the instability of crisis, as it is in the disorientation prayer of Psalm 13, verse 4. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. The denying marker, never be moved or shaken, functions as an objective criterion for defining which psalms are orientation psalms. I pointed this out in my review of Brueggemann's commentary in JBL long ago. So they not only include the creation hymn represented by Psalm 104, verse 5, you set the earth on its foundations so that it shall never be shaken. Not only the psalm of conventional wisdom represented by Psalm 112, the righteous will never be moved, and not only the entrance liturgy represented by Psalm 15, those who do these things shall never be moved, all types of psalms that Brueggemann relegated to the orientation class. But they also include the enthronement psalms represented by Psalm 93, verse 1. He has established the world, it shall never be moved. And Psalm 96, verse 10, the world is firmly established, it shall never be moved, which he put under new orientation. We've been speaking in human terms so far, but it's important to recognize that in the Psalms, God is involved in each of these seasons. First of all, He's there helping when things are going well, in a positive sense by blessing, and in a negative sense by keeping trouble away. We recall that priestly prayer for orientation to continue in Numbers 6:24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. And in this season of orientation, the psalmists are full of praise. Psalm 23 is a classic example of God's blessing in the orientation season, while Psalm 121, with its repeated word keep, exemplifies the keeping power of God. Second, when life takes a wrong turning, they pray for his help in a different way and ask him to rescue them and bring them through. Third, when life returns to an even keel, they bring to him their earnest thanks and they renew their commitment of trust and devotion. So in the Psalms, first of all, we find hymns of praise and psalms of assurance that are both right for the season of orientation. Second, we also find psalms that are prayers of lament. These prayers belong to the season of disorientation. Third, there are songs of thanksgiving with specific praise for what the psalmist acknowledges that God has just done in his life now that the season of reorientation has come. Notice that both the praise and assurance psalms and the thanksgiving songs have to do with the life of orientation, in that they both reflect it at their particular moments, whether original or renewed. But be aware too that the thanksgiving songs as well as the prayer laments are concerned with disorientation. The laments while in the throes of disorientation, and the thanksgivings looking back at it. There are 65 laments and 10 thanksgiving songs. So together these disorientation-related psalms make up half the whole book. Evidently life was often very hard for Old Testament believers. They had many troubles to contend with, which they brought to God. The Christian church tends to ignore the psalms of lament. We concentrate on the happy psalms, with their praise for blessings, and with their thanksgiving for recovery from crisis. And we either confuse that thanksgiving with the praise of orientation, or else apply it to conversion. There is a different theology to match the seasons. Orientation psalms praise God for his continued goodness and blessing. So Psalm 23 says, "Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life." Disorientation and reorientation psalms value his saving help in prospect in the prayer lament and in retrospect in the thanksgivings. Thus Psalm 71 verse 4 prays, "Rescue me, O my God, from the hand of the wicked." And Psalm 116 testifies, "When I was brought low, he saved me." Conceptions of God change remarkably because the seasons align with different expectations for God that arose from the covenant relationship, which was like a signed contract between God and Israel. We may notice that there is a basic logical disconnect between God's work in orientation and disorientation. If God keeps believers from crisis in the orientation phase, how is it that he needs them to save them from it in the disorientation phase? Fundamentally, the Psalms take a pragmatic view, namely that in both cases there was need for God's involvement to keep or to save according to the changing scenes of their lives. The complex realities of human life sometimes defy our attempts at logical theorizing. There is one psalm where all three seasons are mentioned in successive verses, in Psalm 30, from verse 6 onwards. The psalmist looks back wistfully to the once enjoyed season of orientation, saying, "As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you had established me as a strong mountain. He thought life would always be like that. He supposed he would always be able to cope with God's continual support. He was wrong. Trouble invaded his life, and God stood by and let it happen, failing to intervene on the psalmist's side. And so he prayed for God's saving help in a lament. You hid your face. I was dismayed, he says. To you, O Lord, I cried. Eventually, things changed for the better, and the psalmist credited it to God's intervention on his behalf. You've turned my mourning into dancing. You've taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. Psalm 30 is a song of thanksgiving and celebrates the season of renewed orientation. But it also looks back not only to the season of disorientation, but even to the preceding season of orientation. When we read God's word for ourselves, we need to know what season it envisions, and we will get the most out of it when it matches the seasons we ourselves are in. And when we minister to others, we need to empathize with their particular seasons of life, and then we will be able to bring them the right message from Scripture. We have seen that there's a strongly theological dimension to the Psalms' seasons of life. We also need to be aware that there is an ethical side. The God of the Old Testament is essentially a moral God. According to some Psalms in the orientation phase, God blesses and keeps those who share his ethical ideals and apply them to their own lives. Thus Psalm 37, 27 through 29 says, Depart from evil and do good, so you shall abide forever. For the Lord loves justice. He will not forsake his faithful ones. The righteous shall be kept safe forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and live in it forever. And Psalm 84, verse 11 says, No good thing does the Lord withhold from those who walk uprightly. Psalm 24, verses 3 and 4 can likewise say, Those who have clean hands and pure hearts, they will receive blessing from the Lord. Correspondingly, sometimes the prayer laments in the Psalms, as we will see, explain crisis in terms of God punishing those believers who've deviated from his ethical standards. In this case, the logical disconnect we noticed just now no longer applies. The reason for it lies firmly in the human area. However, a thanksgiving song can explain God's salvation from crisis in terms of the psalmist's good lifestyle. Psalm 18, 20 through 27 can say at length that the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. With the loyal you show yourself loyal, with the blameless you show yourself blameless. Precisely by saving the psalmist when crisis struck, rather than by keeping crisis away. The covenant relationship between God and Israel entailed obligations and expectations on both sides. On the human side, there was an expectation that the Israelites would be responsible members of the covenant community, honoring God by maintaining high moral and caring standards. As for God, he was expected to keep his people from harm. But if crisis did occur, he was expected to intervene to rescue them in response to their prayers for help. So Psalm 91, verses 14 and 15 can promise in God's name, Those who love me I will deliver. When they call to me, I will answer them. I will be with them in trouble. And Psalm 34, verse 17 is sure that when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and rescues them from all their troubles. In my lectures this week, I'm mainly investigating the season of disorientation that involves suffering and laying before you scriptures that will help us in our quest. Today, we are beginning by looking at the Psalms. First, we need to appreciate that in the Psalms, the term prayer refers to the prayer lament uttered in a time of existential crisis, not to our routine daily prayers. So it is fitting that it appears in the heading to Psalm 102, a psalm that reflects that very genre of prayer lament, a prayer of one afflicted when faint and pleading before the Lord. Moreover, the prayer in times of crisis functions as a means of persuading God to act on behalf of his suffering people or individual believers. This purpose has been well explained in an article by Patrick Miller, Prayer and Persuasion, the Rhetoric and Intention of Prayer, in a journal, Word and World. This function of persuasion follows naturally from the expectations the Israelites had of their God, expectations that God had taken upon himself in the covenant relationship. Those who pray already know the revealed will of God and just want him to act in accordance with that will. Because as the prayer lament, Psalm 102, says of God in verse 27, "You are the same." Since God does not change, he can be expected to act consistently in certain ways. I want to take some of Miller's examples from the 65 prayers of lament in the Psalms to illustrate the case he makes. Fundamentally, claims for God's help are made on the basis of a pre-existing relationship with God. And that relationship is variously intertwined with the sort of God Yahweh had revealed himself to be. He's a just or righteous God who does the right and fair thing. And so the psalmist can say in Psalm 71, verses 2 and 4, "In your righteousness deliver me, and rescue me, O my God, from the hand of the wicked." Because of the covenantal steadfast love that characterizes God's relationship with the believer, Psalm 6:4 can plead, deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love." God's reputation is at stake in the crisis. Therefore, God is appealed to intervene for your name's sake. That phrase sums up the revealed expectations as to how God does and should act. Thus in Psalm 79, verses 9 and 10, Israel prays, "Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of your name. Deliver us and forgive us for your name's sake. Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?'" Another way of presenting a God-based reason for divine intervention is to praise God in the course of the prayer lament. Praise in this context has quite a different role than what it does in a hymn. It has a persuasive role, reminding God of his obligations. Sometimes in the Psalms, the expectation for God to forgive is expressed explicitly as an item of persuasive praise, as in the lament of Psalm 86 in verse 5. The reason why the psalmist can pray for help is that you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call upon you. On the other hand, this expectation can occur in a hymn with only worshipful praise as its purpose. I'm thinking of Psalm 145 in verse 8. "The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." Of course, the scriptural basis for this expectation is Exodus 34 and verse 6. And in our lecture in Lamentations, we will see that book drawing deliberately on that ancient tradition. In Psalm 102, verses 11 and 12, the respective human and divine characterizations are contrasted. "My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your name endures to all generations." The psalmist, likely to end his life early, is implicitly asking for a share in God's length of life. Psalm 102 has just shown us the other side of this relational coin, namely that the psalmist paints a grim picture of his sufferings to move God to compassion. In Psalm 7, verses 1 and 2, save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, is the motivating prayer. Or like a lion, they will tear me apart. They will drag me away with no one to rescue. Psalm 88 is the most extreme example of this tendency to dwell on the severity of suffering in order to persuade God to intervene in the psalmist's favor. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. The psalmist is as good as dead, so low is his quality of life. The psalmist's three cries to God for help in verses 2, 9, and 13 are each followed by vivid descriptions and interpretations of his suffering. It is important that we discuss the various ways in which the Psalms understand suffering and respond to suffering. And this means concentrating on material from the 65 prayers of lament and also from the 10 songs of thanksgiving. They all talk about existential crisis that has occurred, whether sickness or extreme opposition from other members of the community, in the case of individuals, or about national attack and destruction in the case of the community. How is this suffering explained? First, in most of the prayer laments, God is not said to be directly involved in the initial crisis. Most often, crisis just happens, irrespective of the moral state of believers, without God sending it as a punishment. And we've just seen that Psalm 18, looking back at past crisis, sees absolutely no room for the notion of punishment. Believers can fall prey to external factors that have nothing to do with their particular relationship with God. Then in the laments, they urge God to get involved in a positive way by providing rescue. He is appealed to as an independent third party, separate from the crisis and not responsible for it. The crisis has happened, and the need is for God to get involved for the first time by helping those who pray these particular psalms. The active providence of God in causing what happens occurs after the crisis has struck in the lives of believers and takes the form of his saving work. As part of this group, there are prayer laments that are also psalms of innocence, such as Psalms 7, 17, and 26, that claim the psalmist was not morally responsible for the suffering and give that as a reason for God to intervene and stop it. In Psalm 7, the psalmist utters an oath of innocence in verses 3 through 6. O Lord my God, if there's wrong in my hands, then let the enemy pursue me. He knows he can safely say this when he goes on to say in verse 8, judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to the integrity that is in me. Of course, the classic theological model in the Old Testament for this type of rescue from crisis that involves God's intervention when his people are suffering from an external factor is the Exodus from Egypt. The rescue was from Egyptian oppression. At least, that is how the book of Exodus explains it. However, there's a minority tradition that finds Israel's unfaithfulness to God the underlying reason for their suffering. They were not just victims. Ezekiel is the chief proponent of this view in Ezekiel 20, verses 4 to 10, and Psalm 106 and verse 7 took over this view from Ezekiel. It also appears in Joshua 24 and verse 14, where there is mention of the gods your ancestors served in Egypt. I mention this alternative explanation of the Exodus because it forms a parallel to a significant minority of the prayer laments that take a different line from the rest. This is our second type of approach to suffering we find in the Psalms. These laments bring in a new factor, namely human sinning, and explain the crisis as something that was actually deserved, as in fact the outworking of God's moral providence. Psalm 51 is an obvious example. The plea in verse 8, let the bones that you have crushed rejoice, is part of its prayer for God to forgive, confess sin, and grant a new lease on life. The sufferer is responsible for the crisis because of the sinning that is the rationale for it, while God is also responsible for the crisis in terms of his negative intervention that has brought about the crisis. The sufferer engages in confession so as to assure God of a change of heart, and accordingly he hopes for a change of attitude on God's part. There are other examples in the Psalms, such as Psalms 38 and 69. Psalm 79 is an intermediate psalm that confesses sinning in verses 8 to 9, and so regards a national crisis as something deserved, but claims the actual crisis was out of proportion and excessive, and so the psalm can bring complaints not only against human adversaries, but also against God. This leads me to say that thirdly, there is a group of psalms that not only deny that sinning can be a justifiable reason for the crisis, but also claim that God was wrong in bringing it about or permitting it to happen or failing to stop it. These are prayer laments that bring a complaint against God that he's not living up to revealed expectations. Of course, the prayer laments commonly bring to God a complaint against human enemies, personal or national. However, there are also psalms that feature a complaint against God. Psalm 44 is an example. All this has come upon us, verse 17 says, yet we have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. Another example is Psalm 89, a royal lament that begins with a long hymn about God's almighty power and God's promises in relation to the Davidic covenant as persuasive statements of expectations that God has failed to live up to in the present crisis and ought to. Whereas an orientation psalm, Psalm 121, can promise in verse 3, he who keeps you will not slumber. Psalm 44, verse 23, challenges God. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake and do not cast us off forever. Psalm 35 in verse 23 speaks in the same vein. These psalms are the place where grief can be expressed in the form of frustrated anger that's turned against God. It is regarded as acceptable to speak one's mind in prayer. These psalms are also using complaint as a means of persuasion. Since in the Old Testament prayer aims to persuade God to live up to expectations that he himself had established, this factor opens the door to complaint as an extreme form of persuasion. Complaint is intended to persuade God to re-establish expectations that are hopefully retrievable. In fact, there are 21 psalms of complaint against God out of a total of 65 psalms of lament, virtually a third. The standard textbook for these complaints is by Craig Broyles. It's called The Conflict of Faith and Experience in the Psalms. These psalms very often feature two questions, asking why in bewilderment, and also asking how long an intolerable situation is to last, as in Psalm 74, verses 1 and 10. O God, why do you cast us off forever? And how long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Psalm 88, verse 14, asks the double question, O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Yet, essentially, the complaints stay inside the bounds of faith in God. The reasonableness of this mixed attitude is that if you have a close relationship with someone, you feel free to express your deepest thoughts and feelings and hold nothing back. Psalm 22 and verse 1 provides the classic expression of this combination of complaint and yet maintenance of faith. My God, why have you forsaken me? In verses 2 through 5, The psalmist persists in his personal faith despite his complaint that God has failed to answer his many prayers, in contrast to the tradition that God does answer prayer. Judaism has maintained this alternative tradition of complaint. The prayer and movie Fiddler on the Roof, set in a historical context of Russian anti-Semitism, is a good illustration. In line with the traditional biblical model, the concentration camp survivor Elie Wiesel urged his fellow Jews to complain and argue as believers instead of giving up their faith in reaction to the Holocaust, as so many did. Complaining about God is not a tradition of prayer the Christian church has taken over. I've never heard a sermon on it. Yet there are some comparable examples in the New Testament, especially in the disciples' cry to Jesus in Mark 4:38, which we can translate, "Don't you care that we're drowning?" Interestingly, the later Gospels of Matthew and Luke tone down their cry. According to Mark's Gospel, the disciples judged that Jesus was not living up to an expectation they held about him, and they were trying hard to persuade him to do so. Jesus later affirmed the disciples' expectation when he testified in John 17 and verse 12, "When I was with them, I protected them." In Luke 2:48, Mary, the mother of Jesus, complained to her boy who had stayed behind in the temple, "Why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And in John 11:21 and 32, Martha and Mary separately complained to Jesus that he'd not traveled down to Judea from Galilee as soon as he'd heard that Lazarus was ill to heal him. "Lord," they each say, "if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." In this case, their complaint was to protest an irretrievable deviation from expectations. If Christianity has no use for these complaints at church, except perhaps to argue against them, I'm sure many of us Christians have resorted to private prayer complaints. In my own case, as a child of 11 and a young believer, after being told my mother had passed away after a heart attack, I remember pounding my pillow in bed and saying out loud, "Why did you have to let her die, God?" I did not realize then how scriptural and permissible my reaction was. It was just something I had to say as a Christian. So we have seen that the book of Psalms supplies a number of models for understanding crisis, whether as a solely human experience for which God's help is needed, or as God's providential reaction to sinning that invites confession, or as something for which one complains to God and blames him. The corresponding strategies in the Psalms to move the sufferer forward are of a spiritual nature: simple prayers for help and more complex prayers of either confession or complaint. As I visit patients in the hospital on Fridays, the most common request is, "Please say a prayer for me." There and then, I turn the worries they have shared with me into a litany of prayer. And their words of appreciation as I'm leaving are most often for that prayer as something that has helped them. In turn, the Psalms bring God into the problem of suffering. The variety of their approaches means that the task of honest and careful thought is necessary before we can apply them to our own suffering, which readers of the Psalms are meant to do. So, what have we seen in our study of the Psalms that are setting the scene for the next lectures? We have seen several things that we're going to carry forward in our minds as we look at Old Testament suffering outside the Psalms. First of all, we've noticed the 3 seasons of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation even if reorientation is an excited passing phase on the way to a renewed, settled orientation. We will need to bear those seasons in mind to understand other texts we will meet in our next lectures. Second, we've observed the strongly theological element that accompanies these seasons in terms of the blessing and keeping activities of God celebrated in the orientation psalms, or his saving work that is sought in the prayer laments and found in the thanksgiving songs. Divine providence is traced in both these forms of God's involvement. However, it can be present or absent in tracing the cause of crisis. This variation is linked with a third factor. We've noticed an ethical lament that can surface or not. Especially the prayer laments can radically differ according to whether the ethical misbehavior of believers is judged to be the cause of the crisis or not, and so whether divine providence is actively traced back to their suffering. Fourthly, we've met the frank element of complaint directed against God. Fifthly, we've noticed the force of expectations that underlie the Psalms and a need either to persuade God to honor them or to affirm one's responsible meeting of them. Overall, we've seen the variety of forms that talking to God at a time of suffering can take in the reflection of different ways suffering is understood. In our remaining lectures, we are going to see these factors surfacing again, so it will have proved helpful to study them first in the context of the book of Psalms. In this first lecture, our main task has been to prepare the way for the remaining 3 lectures. We have introduced concepts of the Old Testament spiritual worldview important for the next text we will be studying, rather than focusing particularly on coping strategies. If we want to raise that issue, we think at once of the importance of evaluating the situation of suffering in relation to our faith in the God of the Bible. Fundamentally, we can learn that prayer enables us to do something about our suffering. It clarifies to our hearts and minds as to how it may be alleviated, and it lays hold of spiritual resources we need to help us cope with it. Above all, prayer acknowledges the dynamic reality of God and invites it into the believer's life. It reminds us that God is our God, someone who is on our side. Hebrews 4:16 was stating no new truth, but one the psalmists already knew and practiced when it urged, "Let us approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may find grace to help in time of need."
Well, we have plenty of time for discussion and questions, so here's your opportunity. Please feel free to ask, and I'll let Dr. Allen handle questions directly.
Any offers? Yes.
You raised that category of complaining
Yes.
to God. Is that mostly focused on like a subjective need to complain, or is there also an underlying assumption that God is faithful and will act consistently to hear complaints?
Yes. There are 2 foundations for complaint. One is you feel the human situation justifies it. And that is so because you have expectations of God. God has revealed his will, God has revealed his covenant relationship. He's made promises, you've got to live up to them, God. And overall, as I say, especially it's part of the tool for persuasion, persuading God to take your side. Life is so grim, if God doesn't help you out, you've had it. And so you need to use every tool you can to persuade God to intervene. I think that's what a psalmist would say. Yes.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak to us. I think suffering is a very relevant topic. I had a question about your reference to the disciples' reaction to Jesus in Mark 4, where they asked, "Don't you care that we are drowning?"
Yes.
And you make reference to him in John saying that he was protecting them.
Yes.
But in that exact pericope, he actually kind of rebukes them for not having faith. How do you balance Jesus' response?
Those disciples could only react to the situation as they knew it then. And they were honest in their prayer to Jesus, if you call it prayer. And they don't say, oh, well, if we sit still and do nothing, I hope that Jesus is going to intervene. No! They're going to say something. Come on, Jesus, you're going to do it. He's asleep! God damn it, he's asleep! And there's that passion there, that emotional passion. And prayer is sometimes an emotional thing that we bring to God, rather than, please bless me, Lord, today. And it's not flat. It's bringing to God where we are and how we see things. And that's all they could do in that situation. And they were afraid Jesus would go on sleeping. And they'd all drown, Jesus too. And Jesus perhaps could rise from death by drowning, but they couldn't. and so there's their problem. And they face up to that problem. And it's all very well to say, oh, well, they shouldn't have complained because it works out all right in the end. And Martha and Mary, well, he did more than come and heal them. He raised Lazarus from the dead. If they waited, no. That's not how scripture thinks. You're reacting to Jesus. You're reacting to God from this present situation. And that's the most you can do. And he's honest.
Brings up this final section of it brings up the issue really of theology of God in terms of how persuadable is he? If there is a strategy in all these Psalms, which is, as you've explained it, various ways of talking to God, hoping to persuade him to come in on your side and fulfill his promises, then does that assume then a picture of God in which he is certainly persuadable through prayer of these various kinds?
I think so, because one thing it does is to force the believer, the believing psalmist, to think of those expectations, to think of God. What should God be doing? And you turn to thinking about God and thinking seriously about it, not just about your human crisis, but you're relating it to God. And so there's this ought factor that comes in as a result. And it's very much commended in those Psalms. Yes. But it certainly isn't a feature of Christian prayer, and we've given up the Psalms in that respect. Yes.
I kind of feel uncomfortable with the idea of trying to persuade God. And maybe it's because of my background. I don't know if maybe there's difference in different cultures how they do that. I can see that in the moment. I would say, God, why did this happen?
Yes.
But just the idea of persuading, because God knows what I need. He wants me to pray. I wonder if this kind of terminology, persuasion, works when a person truly is submerged and understands the scripture and understands God, where, in our culture of entitlement, we want to persuade God to be on our side, so it can be dangerous to use the term persuasion, because here in America, we want things easy, and we're given things easy, so we expect God to fulfill our needs, but yet we may not know, so we're danger of that terminology.
I think one thing we didn't talk about, well, why is it we don't like the idea of persuading God? And the psalmists are saying, we know God's will. He stated these expectations. And we can claim them. We can claim these promises from God. So you better get moving, God, and live up to those expectations. And I think our concern in the West especially, and perhaps in Asia and Africa too, I don't know, is that we're individualistic. We say, what's God's will for me? Different from God's will for him or for her, and I don't know that will, and so I'm just going to pray to God, and they're not persuaded. Whereas the psalmists are thinking much more generally theologically of a communal relationship that Israel has with God, and taking seriously that communal covenant and the promises that are associated with it. And so there's a basic difference, and I think fundamentally that there's a cultural difference, that we're so individualistic. God's will for me is this, God's will for him is something quite different, and you're not treating it theologically. I don't know if that's a help. I'd be warned that presenting this to a nation group, they may find it difficult to accept. And the chairman of the Tokyo committee think it's something that we need to hear, this sort of approach.
Yes, when I was a boy, I got one of those New Testaments with Psalms
Yes.
at the end.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered over the years, why the Psalms is the book chosen to go with the New Testament. And I kind of thought, well, it's probably because Christians, if there is a part of the Old Testament that they would cherish, would be the Psalms.
Yes.
And yet there's the irony, as you point out, that fully half the Psalms are lament or lament oriented.
Yes.
And it seems like the church has ignored those.
Yes.
And I just wonder what you think as to why that dichotomy. There's
Well,
a cherished on one hand and yet ignored on the other.
I know. I think I said at one point, life is very hard for those Israelites in their history. I think the Christian church, apart from times of persecution, has had it pretty good. They've been the major religion, and they can dictate to others what they should believe. And Christians have been top dogs, and as a result, you don't think so much in terms of crisis, which people lower down in that social level experience. And that's all I can say as the major reason. So we've got the problem of individualism and the problem of triumphalism in the Christian church. Two factors, I think, which take us away from the Psalms perspective. Yes.
Yeah, it seems like your section on the complaint psalms is the most provocative,
Yes,
at least
it
for
is.
us.
It is.
I'm wondering, you mentioned that it seems like Christianity has no use for those psalms except perhaps to complain against or to argue against them.
Yes.
How would the book of Job interface with that? It seems like Job may be a dramatization of a complaint,
You are right.
but at the end,
You're right. Yes.
he says, I have spoken what I do not understand. And so he sort of gets put in his place for complaining
Yeah.
at the
Well,
end.
that's something that awakes our fourth lecture.
Oh.
So, because of the fascination and complexity of the Book of Psalms is that it embraces every known idea as the reason for suffering, and it presents them all in turn. And so I need a whole hour to look forward to sort out Job. But this is, we're laying a foundation here, and so hold on. If we survive to that fourth lecture, then I would say all will be explained. But
I won't complain. I'll wait.
I wonder, in terms of what you said about the theology of all the lament psalms, Psalm 88 being the only lament psalm that doesn't have a upbeat to it, do you think that's saying something larger theological, or is it just one person never saw God show up?
Yeah. I sometimes say that in Visiting Patients, Psalm 88 is the last psalm I want to bring before them. But there are cases where people are absolutely down and out in their minds and hearts, and it's a very special psalm. And essentially, the essential part are those three places, which is asking God to save and to help. And then you've got these persuasive material of saying how difficult life is. And so three appeals to God, but in between persuasively setting out how disastrous the situation is for the psalmist. And I think if we're not careful, commentaries and preachers can look at those grim elements and not see them that they're in the service of this plea to God 3 times to help, and they need to persuade God that life is terrible life is terrible, Lord, help me. Life is terrible, Lord, help me. And so I would say the essence of the Psalms, of that particular Psalm, is those three petitions that are being brought to God. And I don't know if you think that's a fair answer, or whether you want to go beyond that.
Well, I'm wondering if if the lack of an upbeat at the end is the suggestion that there are times God doesn't do anything, doesn't respond, is not persuasive.
We're going to find the same thing in Lamentations, and I'm going to say that it's a persuasive note. If you don't help, damn! You know, everything's gone. You know, so you better do something, Lord. Yes. Lamentations also ends on a downbeat note, and that's been very much overstressed in recent commentary writing, and one needs to think a bit deeper as to that negativity there at the end. Yes.
Most of the laments conclude with the hymn of praise. And so it makes me wonder if a typology of orientation, disorientation, reorientation, which makes it sound, even if it is cyclical, makes it sound very linear, and makes it sound like these are separate impulses within the life of faith. Does the fact that you can in Psalms have a lament followed by a hymn of praise imply that these are actually intermingled within the life of faith, and that an individual is constantly struggling with both of these realities?
That could be one way of explaining it. Another way, and one thing I didn't say because it doesn't directly engage in my other lectures, is that certain psalms seem to imply, and commentaries infer this from the language used, imply that a priest has intervened and saying God's going to answer your prayer. And so Psalm 22, the first half is lament, and the second half is full of praise. But there's a crucial verb which is hidden away in the text, but usually in a footnote. You've answered me, Lord. Halfway through the psalm, you've answered me, Lord. And there comes a word from a priest or a temple prophet saying, it's going to be okay, the Lord's heard your prayer. And you accept that by faith. Nothing is changed outwardly. Absolutely the same situation, but you accept that by faith. And so you start to praise God. And so the second half of Psalm 22 is a sort of incipient thanksgiving. It's preparation. I know I'm going to come back. I know with Thanksgiving next time, the next festival. And there's this assurance there. But you've answered me. You've answered me. And so certain cases where you find praise at the end implies that there's a sort of off-screen event that's happened, and that intervention has come with an assurance through a human temple intermediary that God's going to answer this prayer of lament and all will be well. And so you respond in faith, not in experience. Crisis doesn't change, you respond in faith to that situation. Yes.
It seems to me, this is the way I understood it, at least my own spirituality, my goal is to submit my will to God's will. And so I can relate very much to the psalmist with its own individual level. I struggled with repetitions for many years. Not a kingdom of Christ, it was the psalm that spoke. And the psalm that filled my street seat. And I see where somebody was complaining to God, as will God. But as I then walk with the Lord more and more, I started to realize more scriptures that talk about God's sovereignty, like in the Old Testament in Genesis, where Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, and things of that nature. And so as I continue to walk with the Lord, I try to then just understand the sovereignty of God behind the suffering. And although I cry out to God to change circumstances, I end with, but not my will, your will be done, like Jesus. I mean, is that something that you get to work within what you're talking about?
Yes, I think that's an important factor. It doesn't impede so much on the text I've chosen to follow on with. But that's something to bear in mind.
Someone else first.
There's only that small.
I had this, one point in your lecture, you talked about how the Psalms bring God into the trouble of suffering. And because there are these variety of Psalms and approaches,
Yes.
3 phases and so on, we reflect quite carefully before we apply the Psalms to our suffering. So, presumably because we have to decide whether the suffering is, we're in orientation, reorientation, disorientation phase, or because we have to decide, is this the kind of suffering that a particular psalm refers to?
Yes.
And do the Psalms give us any clue as to how to distinguish, which Psalms are appropriate, which approach is appropriate for us as we reflect on our own situation?
I think we're left to our own spiritual reasoning and to the help of the Holy Spirit in deciding. I think of that famous or infamous pair of verses in the Psalms. Answer a fool according to his folly. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Oh! Well, it doesn't matter then, does it? Oh, yes, it does matter. But it depends on circumstances. And in that wisdom setting, I envision a seminar where a professor assigns to 2 students, when do you answer a fool according to his folly, and when do you not? And reasoning it out. And there's some times that lend themselves to one, and other times where they're aware that this isn't so. But we've got to fall back on knowing when to apply scriptures to ourselves. And that's all one could say. And the Psalms they throw at us, this variety of approaches, and we've got to decide where we fit in. And sometimes you get that mixture. Psalm 79 is a fascinating psalm because it's got a mixed reaction. Yeah, we sinned, but we didn't deserve all this punishment, God. That's not fair. And so there could be that mixture there. Yes. If a Christian couple get divorced, each one could say, it was your fault, it was your fault. But they're probably both right. They're probably both right. Of course, on both sides in point of view.
What would it look like if this understanding of prayer and in the middle of suffering was to be reintegrated or integrated into, evangelical church liturgy or practice on a regular basis? How would you envisage something like that actually being worked out?
Well, there'd be objections, first of all, from the deacons and that. We know it's scriptural, but I don't know, what can one say? Yes.
I had the experience in my local church about 4 or 5 years ago where my pastor decided to preach through the Psalms
Yes.
straight through from in book 1.
Yes.
He stopped after that one
Right.
thing. But coming into the he made it back to it. But coming into the service every Sunday on the screen up front it said learning to lament. Psalms 141. And his approach was precisely what that type said, and I thought that was great. It was very good.
Yes. Good. That was a good example.
Because as you know, book 1 of the Psalter has the heavily loaded laments as opposed to later.
That's right.